Welcome, everyone, to today's MDHR Workforce Webinar Series on implicit bias. It is my pleasure to introduce Kevin Lindsay, who was appointed Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights in February 2011. He had previously served as civil litigation attorney in the office of Ramsey County Attorney and has over 20 years of experience in resolving complex legal and public policy questions. Please welcome Commissioner Kevin Lindsay.
Christine, thank you for that very warm introduction. And thank you out in the audience for registering for today's presentation on implicit bias by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. During the presentation today, please feel free to send me your questions. While I will not stop to take your questions as I receive them during the presentation, please know that I intend, with the help of my friends from the department, to sort through all of the questions that we receive from you, and that we will attempt to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If you have previously attended one of our presentations or seminars in the past, I will share with you that today's presentation will lean more heavily on social science research as opposed to the interpretation of federal and Minnesota case law. Thus, if you're looking for us to discuss one legal case after another, I apologize at the outset because we're probably going to disappoint you today. I'm sure that there's probably some of you who are very happy that we're not going to go over one case after another. The roadmap for today is short and sweet. We will begin by defining implicit bias. We will then illustrate why responding to implicit bias is important by discussing how research from a variety of different settings demonstrates the breadth of implicit bias within our society and how failing to mitigate for implicit bias may lead to negative consequences. We will then discuss what steps each of us can take to address and mitigate the impact of implicit bias. So let us begin by defining implicit bias. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. What do I mean by actions that occur in an unconscious manner? I mean actions and decisions that are involuntary, automatic, fast, and effortless. Let's flesh out the concept of implicit bias a little further.
You have that muted?
Psychologists estimate that our brains are capable of processing approximately 11 million bits of information every second. If you doubt how wonderful you are today, appreciate the speed by which you can process information. In his 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman articulates a widely accepted framework for understanding human cognitive functioning by delineating our mental processing into two parts, System 1 and System 2. System 1 handles cognition that occurs outside of conscious awareness. This system operates automatically and extremely fast. For example, let's say you're stopped at a red light in your car. When the light turns green, you know how to proceed through the intersection. You don't think about it. Thanks to the speed and efficiency of System 1, experienced drivers know what it means when the light turns green, and they're able to safely navigate through traffic. The mental association requires no conscious or effort in thought. In contrast, System 2 is conscious processing. System 2 is what we use for mental tasks that require concentration, such as completing a tax form. Rather than being automatic and fast, this undertaking requires effortful, deliberate concentration. Together, these two systems help us make sense of our world. What is fascinating about this research is how much we rely on System 1. Of the millions of possible pieces of information that we process each second, most neuroscientists agree that the vast majority of our cognitive processing occurs outside of our conscious awareness. Besides its vastness, System 1 cognitive processing is also notable because it helps us understand that many of the mental associations that affect how we perceive and act are operating implicitly, acting unconsciously. As such, System 1 is responsible for the associations known as implicit bias. Because the implicit associations we hold arise outside of conscious awareness, implicit biases may not necessarily align with our explicit beliefs and stated intentions. This means that even individuals who profess egalitarian intentions and try to treat all individuals fairly can still unknowingly act in ways that reflect their implicit rather than their explicit biases. Thus, even well-intentioned individuals can act in ways that produce inequitable outcomes for different groups. Moreover, because implicit biases are unconscious and involuntarily activated as part of System 1, we're not even aware that they exist. Yet they can have a tremendous impact on our decision-making. A large body of social science evidence has shown that implicit biases can be activated by any number of various identities we perceive in others, such as race, ethnicity, gender, or age. Since these robust associations are a critical component of our System 1 processing, everyone has implicit biases, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or age. No one is immune. Consequently, the range of implicit bias implications for individuals in a wide range of areas is vast. For example, researchers have documented implicit biases in employment. They've documented among healthcare professionals, in the area of education, and among law enforcement officers. Our implicit biases are the result of the mental associations that we have formed within our minds from the direct and indirect messaging that we have received over time. When we are constantly exposed to certain individuals being associated with certain attributes over time through direct and indirect messaging, we begin to automatically and unconsciously associate those attributes to those individuals whether or not those attributes have any basis in reality. Why then is addressing implicit bias important? Addressing implicit bias is important because of its impact on creating, sustaining, and maintaining structural inequity in our communities. Failing to address implicit bias threatens our democracy and the long-term economic viability of our society. Democracy is not inevitable. Democracy does not exist in the United States simply because Americans regard it as the best of all possible political systems. Rather, democracy exists in this country because the majority of American people believe in the basic concepts of our democracy, such as fundamental fairness and equality for all people. Let me fully acknowledge that I am cognizant of the history of the United States. I appreciate that at the founding of the country, African Americans were viewed as subhumans and that the phrase, "we the people," did not include women. I'm also aware that our nation's history includes instances in which we have dehumanized American Indians by failing to recognize treaties and through such events as the Trail of Tears, in which individuals were starved to death as they were driven from their ancestral homes. Our history is also stained by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, as well as Executive Order 9066, which was signed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt 75 years ago, and which authorized the internment of more than 110,000 Japanese Americans during World War II. As most of you know, more than 60% of those Japanese Americans that were interned were actually born in the United States. We, however, have as a country sought to create a more perfect union by becoming more inclusive over time and expanding our democracy to include those that were excluded at the founding of the nation and to enfranchise women. We have also attempted to right the wrongs of our past by attempting to eradicate discrimination. There, for example, the Minnesota Human Rights Act prohibits discrimination and notes that the evil of discrimination threatens the rights and privileges of the inhabitants of this state and menaces the institutions and foundations of democracy. While our path to inclusion and the respect for others has not always been linear, and in an effort to paraphrase Dr. King on this, we have sought to bend the moral arc of our country toward justice, fairness, and equality as we build and work toward creating a more perfect union. Accordingly, the majority of Americans now believe that a person should not be held back for an arbitrary reason such as race, color, religion, or gender. If our democracy is to continue to thrive, we must ensure that all people receive equality of opportunity, equality before the law, and that no one is held back for arbitrary reasons. All people must be able to fully pursue their dreams and be treated as equals under the law. We have come a great distance toward the goal of equality for all in this country. It is clear, however, that there is still considerable distance that needs to be made. Accordingly, allowing implicit bias to flourish within our society permits disparate outcomes and discrimination to take root. Disparate outcomes and discrimination undermine the foundations of our democracy. Therefore, addressing implicit bias in our society is critically important if we are to have a strong and vibrant society and democracy. Let's take a few minutes to see how implicit bias is currently impacting us. A few decades ago, it was highly unusual for audiences at symphonies to see women performing in orchestras. Today, it's not unusual to see many women performing in orchestras. What happened? One change that occurred was the dramatic impact on the number of women that received offers from symphonies was when selection committees made a change in how they evaluated the talent of the people auditioning. What was the change? The change was that the symphony conductors and the hiring committees turned their chairs around so that they could not see the musicians while they were auditioning. Once the hiring committees could not see the musicians, female musicians began receiving better scores during auditions and subsequently received more job offers. Of course, beyond our eyes, we take in information with our ears. In 2014, there was a study done which focused on the impact of a speaker's voice, race identification, and stereotyping in the employment process. Participants within the study were presented with a recording of a callback message left on a hiring manager's answering machine by a white, black, and American-born, native English-speaking Chinese man. Participants in the study were then asked to describe their perception of the speaker's physical characteristics and to answer evaluation questions related to the speaker's character attributes. The researchers found the participants' racial perception of the subject voice strongly influenced their perceptions of the speaker's character attributes. In particular, participants rated those they perceived to be white or Asian speakers significantly more favorable than those individuals that they perceived to be black. Most notably, while 71.4% and 85.7% of the participants stated that they would definitely consider hiring the speaker they considered to be white or Asian, respectively, only 8.2% of the participants stated that they would definitely consider hiring the speaker they perceived to be black. The researchers noted that these findings were consistent with prior research on implicit stereotyping, in which studies on speech and race have found listeners ascribing racial stereotypes to unseen speakers. I will share with you on a personal note, I remember an incident as a young lawyer about 20 years ago being on a phone call with an attorney from another state in which the attorney used a racial slur during the course of telling me a joke on the phone. He was very surprised to learn that he was not able to tell my race by my speech pattern. Of course, he was likely operating under the assumption that there were likely few African Americans practicing law in the early 90s in the Twin Cities, and those practicing law were probably likely not employed by large international law firms. Finally, what's in a name? Apparently, there is a lot to a name. In response to Help Want Ads in Chicago and Boston newspapers, two researchers with the National Bureau of Economic Research sent resumes with either African American or white-sounding names to hundreds of employers. The researchers then measured the number of callbacks each resume received for interviews. Half of the applicants were assigned African American names that were remarkably common in the black population. The other half, white-sounding names such as Emily Walsh or Greg Baker, were given. The researchers found a 50% gap in callback rates, which they calculated as being equivalent to an additional 8 years of experience for a candidate. Race, the authors added, also affects the reward for having a better resume. White individuals who were perceived with higher quality resumes received a 30% higher callback rate than those with a lower quality resume. However, the positive impact of a better resume did not translate for those with African American sounding names. This specific report can be found in a paper entitled, "Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal?" A field experiment on labor market discrimination. How people hear, see, and initially think about a candidate from just becoming aware of the person's name can significantly impact their employment opportunities. Most of you are seeing the slide of the young gentleman there with a suit and a tie. A face that probably looks very welcoming to many of you. Some of you may be surprised that this is a picture of Ted Bundy, a serial killer. So this idea of sort of what we're able to initially see or hear or perceive, we have to be careful that we don't fall susceptible to implicit bias. Let's switch gears and talk about some of the studies that researchers have recently undertaken in the area of education. In 2015, researchers employed an experiment that was the first of its kind to empirically test the effects that race has on teachers' perceptions of problematic behaviors. The experiment consisted of 2 studies. In the first portion of the study, researchers showed a racially diverse group of female K-12 teachers, the researchers showed a racially diverse group of female K-12 teachers the school records of a fictitious middle school student who had misbehaved twice. Both of these infractions were minor and unrelated. Requesting that the teachers imagine working at the school, researchers then asked the teachers a range of questions related to how they perceived and would respond to the students' infractions. While the student discipline scenarios were identical, researchers manipulated the fictitious student's name. Some teachers reviewed the record of a student given a stereotypical black name, Deshaun or Darnell, while others bore a stereotypical white name, such as Jake or Greg. Results indicated that from the first infraction to the second, teachers were more likely to escalate the response to the second infraction when the student was perceived to be black as opposed to white. Significant differences based on race were not found, however, if the teaching scenario listed only one behavioral incident. The second study addressed teachers' perceptions of what a particular bad behavior incident indicated a pattern or was perceived as an isolated incident. Using a similar study design, findings showed that teachers rated the incident as more troubling and warranting of discipline if the student was black. Additionally, teachers were more likely to attribute behaviors to a large pattern and were more likely to predict future suspension if the student was black than if the student was white. Moreover, labeling the student as a troublemaker mediated these relationships between race and the choice of disciplinary action. This finding, as a personal note, may be more troubling as labeling students as troublemakers may lead students to a self-fulfilling prophecy in which they strive to live up to the label given to them as a troublemaker. Reflecting on these results, the researchers wrote that the influence of implicit bias was strong among participants, noting that explicit bias did not predict the findings and that our effects persisted while controlling for explicit bias of the participants. In 2015, Professor Ashley Yull published a report, The Impact of Race and Socioeconomic Status of Access to Accommodations in Post-Secondary Education, in the American University Journal of Gender, Social Policy, and the Law. Yull, in her article, dedicated a section to addressing the role of implicit and explicit bias on those students in analysis of the effect of race and economics on students' access to accommodations. Yull suggested that the symptoms typically associated with autism itself may predispose individuals to activate negative implicit biases, such as people not familiar with autism symptoms, misperceiving autistic individuals as being violent or dangerous. Moreover, Yull's work suggested that the effects of implicit bias on the perceptions of aggression may be compounded if the student is part of a racial minority group. Finally, a report from the National Center for Youth Law suggested that implicit bias within the education system could lead to racial disproportionality in the child welfare and mental health systems. The report described key decision points within each of these three separate but connected domains as a gateway for individuals' implicit biases to invade seemingly objective processes. The authors of the study noted that the implicit bias within the domains led to increased office referrals, more often being removed from class, and ultimately influenced educational outcomes. The report identified several strategies to address implicit bias, such as introducing more data-based accountability, creating a more preventative focus orientation to the organization and systems, as well as increasing cultural competency of individuals working within the education, child welfare, and mental health care systems. Let's transition to healthcare. Healthcare providers have recently been paying more attention to the impact of implicit bias in the delivery of healthcare. Some of the prior findings concerning the impact of implicit bias in healthcare have suggested that non-white patients receive fewer cardiovascular interventions and fewer renal transplants, that black women are sometimes more likely to die after being diagnosed with breast cancer, and that black men are less likely to receive chemotherapy and radiation therapy for prostate cancer. Patients of color are more likely to be blamed for being too passive about their health care, and that non-white patients are less likely to be prescribed pain medications. As to that point, there was an interesting study done last year which explored the differences in the ability of individuals to be able to assess pain being expressed by another person of a different race. The study participants were Caucasian and Chinese individuals in Beijing. The researchers conducted trials in which participants were sequentially presented with two faces. The first face either had a neutral expression or an expression of pain, whereas the second displayed an expression of pain. The results from the study demonstrated that although all participants exhibited shifts in neurological activity for the first face when presented with an expression of pain as opposed to a neutral expression, that the shifts in neurological activity were larger when participants were shown faces of individuals who shared the same race as a participant. The findings of the study were consistent with the findings of previous studies that revealed implicit racial attitudes to be a significant predictor of physicians' pain management decisions along racial lines. Let's move to law enforcement. There has been extensive research into the concept of the use of force by law enforcement. An example of the use of force by law enforcement is demonstrated by shooter bias. Shooter bias refers to how implicit associations related to blackness and weapons in the United States can affect the speed and accuracy of shooting decisions. Typically, the researcher asks participants to first take the Harvard Implicit Association test. Participants are then asked to participate in a simulation in which they are asked to quickly react to whether the target is holding a weapon or a tool. Participants are then typically instructed to only shoot the target, which can be white, Asian, or black, when the target has a weapon. Studies find that the black targets are shot in the simulation more often when they have a non-weapon in their hand than any other target. Researchers conclude that white participants' fear of non-white individuals increases the likelihood of a mistake being made in the simulation, and that mistakes are less likely to occur among individuals when they are members of the same racial or ethnic group as the target. Related studies have found that there is often a pro-white bias with which whites are generally seen as being more law-abiding among individuals within law enforcement, which in turn results in fewer police incidents of police brutality. As a result, this pro-white bias may contribute to the existence of fewer errors in shooter tasks and when whites are holding something other than a gun. Shooter bias has also been tested in the international context. In a recent research effort, individuals from Saudi Arabia participated in online experiments in which they saw characters that varied as to race, Middle Eastern versus white. They saw characters that varied as relates to the possession of a weapon, some that had a weapon, others that did not. And then also the characters varied as it relates to wearing headwear, whether that being a baseball hat or traditional Saudi Arabian headwear. The participants were instructed to press a button that indicated to shoot or not to shoot the simulated target. Results demonstrated an in-group bias where Saudi Arabian individuals were more likely to shoot white targets. Of course, this replicates effects of similar in-group bias, similar to participants in the United States. However, Saudi Arabian individuals were also more likely to shoot targets wearing their traditional head attire than a baseball cap. This study is an important reminder that we must always remember that implicit bias can also occur when we are influenced by negative cultural stereotypes, such as clothes that an individual is wearing. The implicit bias do not always go along the lines of just simply race. What should you draw from these examples from these wide variety of areas? There are three main points that I'd like for you to take away from these examples of implicit bias that we discussed. First, implicit bias is prevalent throughout our society from employment, education, healthcare, and law enforcement. Second, implicit bias is driven by our knowledge of what we know and feel most comfortable. In-group bias is consistent. Recall the ability to recognize pain in the faces which we are more familiar, and the shooter research from Saudi Arabia. Third, implicit bias doesn't exist in a vacuum. The history and culture of a society that you live in drives the implicit bias which exists in the minds of people. Accordingly, if people have received negative messages in a society concerning a group of people on the basis of race, national origin, religion, or gender over a long period of time, we should expect that we're going to have to work toward eradicating the implicit bias that has been allowed to be established in the minds of the people in that society. Well, what are the next steps then that can be taken? Now that we have identified instances where implicit bias has led to negative outcomes, let's discuss what is being done by organizations to mitigate the impact of implicit bias. The following is not meant to be a comprehensive list of all the activities being undertaken. Let's start where we ended with law enforcement. An interesting study from Professor R.J. Smith found that when implicit bias training occurred along with structural changes in policy in a law enforcement agency, that law enforcement agencies were able to see a tangible reduction in racial bias within policing. Thus, where law enforcement agencies provide implicit bias training along with changes in department policies, such as a policy change where the law enforcement officer differs from the arrest as relates to the individual who initially chased the suspect. So if police officer A chases the suspect and there are two partners there, the effectuation, the actual placing of the handcuffs and the processing of the arrest, if it's done by a second officer, law enforcement agencies saw a reduced overall use of force as well as racial disproportionality in the use of force in the law enforcement agency. The Kalamazoo Police Department in Michigan implemented notable reforms after reports showed a staggering amount of racial profiling being done in the department. An organization that studies racial profiling analyzed police stops at 12 locations in Kalamazoo between March of 2012 to 2013. The researchers found that police stopped black motorists more than twice as often as they stopped white motorists. However, despite searching, handcuffing, and arresting more blacks, whites were more likely to be found with contraband such as guns and drugs. The report led to new policies aimed to reduce racial profiling and build trust between black residents and the police. The department worked with an outside source from one of the local colleges who helped the law enforcement agency, understand implicit bias. Public safety chief required mandatory racial bias training and mandated all officers to document probable cause for every search they conducted. Officers were also instructed to use a more personalized and community-oriented approach to policing by walking neighborhoods and talking to residents. As a result of these combined efforts, overall crime declined by 7% in Kalamazoo, all while officers initiated fewer traffic stops. The police chief there acknowledged that ending racial profiling and repairing the strained relationship between black residents and the police will take time, but he acknowledged that progress was already being made. In his words, quote, achieving crime reduction while at the same time maintaining the relationship with the community. Let's proceed to healthcare. Researchers Ansel and McDonald noted that decisions in healthcare entities to accept insurance plans that serve high numbers of low-income individuals of color and undertaking a recruiting effort to attract more black students and faculty at the hospital might exacerbate implicit bias. In an effort to address an upsurge in implicit bias within the organization, the researchers emphasized the need for, 1, increased oversight of care quality and equality, institutional racial climate assessments, 3, as an open dialogue and education on implicit bias among students, faculty, staff, administrators, and patients. Similar studies in healthcare have emphasized creating an inclusive learning environment among residents and promoting opportunities for positive intergroup interaction activities within the medical training curriculum can have positive impacts on reducing implicit bias. I think this is important to sort of tie in, again, the goals of what you're seeking to address within implicit bias, providing data to individuals who are being impacted by the training or receiving the training in implicit bias, and then also providing a safe space for communication and conversation. In the area of education, the results from the Amherst Public School District are also promising. In the Amherst Public School District, black students last year made up 7% of the Amherst student body, yet they made up 22% of the kids that were suspended. Latinos comprised 13% of the school population, but yet comprised 29% of all the students suspended. Moreover, approximately 85% of the teachers in Amherst are white. The district took several action steps to improve school discipline outcomes. First, it instituted in-depth teacher trainings about stereotypes and behavior. Second, administrators changed the student code of conduct so several behaviors like leaving the classroom or swearing at the teacher were no longer resulting in automatic zero-tolerance suspensions. After the first year with the new changes, suspensions decreased from 84 to 9 at the same point in the same school year. In 2003, Duke University began the first Black Faculty in 2003, Duke University began their Black Faculty Strategic Initiative with the goal of doubling the number of black faculty from 44 to 88 in 10 years. Within 9 years, Duke had already accomplished its goal with 138 African American faculty members in tenure and non-tenure track positions. The leadership at Duke noted the importance of including existing faculty in conversations on how implicit bias can shape hiring decisions, as well as including them in the recruitment approaches, as well as providing faculty and staff with a diversity toolkit, which included an implicit bias coaching video. Again, what are the lessons that can be drawn from these efforts being undertaken to address implicit bias? First, addressing implicit bias in the workplace does not happen overnight. You should set realistic goals as to the timetable for change. Second, providing implicit bias training is more likely to be successful when implicit bias training is coupled with providing data as to how implicit bias manifests itself and explaining how the training is tied to larger goals of the organization or society. 3, providing implicit bias training is more likely to be successful when implicit bias training is coupled with a commitment to open dialogue and conversation about the underlying strategy and commitment to address implicit bias. Finally, let me say that it is critically important that training be provided in a manner and that the discussion around implicit bias be done in a manner that it does not leave the recipients of the training feeling as that they are inherently bad people. I hope and trust that you have heard the presentation today and understand while that we all may have implicit bias, we do not always have to submit to our implicit bias. You may wish to consider taking the implicit association test at implicit.harvard.edu. Consider studying history and looking for connections between the past and the current realities of our situation of inequality today. Then there are other things which we can take into account and we should keep in mind. We can change the messaging that exists in our society to mitigate the impact of implicit bias. There is nothing that says that we are beholden to maintaining the current messages that we have. We can commit ourselves to educating ourselves to mitigate about the impact of implicit bias. And finally, we can be committed to critically examining how our organizations make decisions to mitigate the impact of implicit bias. I want to thank you for being a part of our webinar, our first on implicit bias at the Department of Human Rights. I'm going to pause for a moment and see if we have any questions, and then I'll come back on the line. Thank you. Hello again, this is Commissioner Kevin Lindsay of the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. Taking a look at questions in our chat box. The first question that I see there is a question concerning whether implicit bias is always bad. And the answer to that is implicit bias, there's no value judgment to it. So implicit bias can result in either positive or negative consequences. And there are many instances in which our implicit bias leads to positive outcomes for us. The key question, however, is for us to examine our implicit biases where they lead to sort of negative consequences, or they lead to us making decisions which are inconsistent with our values and what we consider important. So another question is, how do you suggest addressing training for implicit bias without making people feel as if they are bad people? I think one of the things which I have found in the course of either implicit bias training or diversity and inclusion training is that it is helpful for folks to hear from the presenters that they have either the bias or that they have failed themselves in creating an inclusive workforce or inclusive environment. I think the challenge for a lot of us within this respective area is thinking that somehow the only people that are worthy to be in the space are those folks that are perfect and not made a mistake. So again, part of the reason why I talk a little bit about the history of our country is this idea of continuous improvement as opposed to saying all individuals are perfect. So to the idea that we're striving each and every day to become better, to the extent that we can acknowledge where we have fallen short, to the extent that we can then aspire to doing better, I think those are important things to remind individuals. So again, I think these universalist kind of themes are important to ensure that you weave into presentations that you provide on implicit bias as well as diversity and inclusion. I see that there's another question as it relates to good training programs. Unfortunately, there's no sort of good housekeeping seal of approval that I can give as it relates to one program or another. But we will try to strive within the department website to identify some things for you to take into consideration when evaluating whether a training program is good or not. Thoughts, do I have thoughts as it relates to generational bias, as it relates to implicit bias that individuals have? Yes, age is one in which we have implicit bias as a society. I think one of the things which will be very interesting for the United States in the next 10 to 15 years is with the changing demographics of where, from an overall population standpoint, where less than 10% of our population was over the age of 65, we'll move within 15 years to having about 20% or slightly more than 20% of our population being over the age of 65. What will that then mean? So the idea of advertising, the idea of promotion, the idea of television shows and movies focusing in concerning an age group typically between teenage to mid-30s or early 40s, what will that then mean for the images, for products which are sold, for stories which are told as we all start to live longer? So there's clearly an implicit bias. One that I did not talk about today, that I gave some thought about including within the materials, is implicit bias as it relates to weight. So this idea as it relates to are people competent if they are individuals that weigh more than what you might see on TV or you might see within advertising? How does that impact how people perceive their ability to do work or to be successful? Could have also talked about today as it relates to implicit bias concerning height. I mean, if we look at sort of studies concerning leadership and individuals held within certain positions, there is a tendency to ascribe leadership attributes to individuals that are over 6 feet tall if you are male. Now, those things are there. They are present. We do also have to balance and ask ourselves the question as it relates to, from a societal standpoint, is the implicit bias that we find in some of these areas negatively impacting and preventing us from being as successful as an overall society as where we see implicit bias in other areas? And that's not to say that the implicit bias in these other areas should not be addressed, but it is one in which we're trying to be holistic and by trying to put together a strategy to be successful in mitigating the impact of implicit bias. Question about, does the agency offer in-person training on hiring and retention? So the department does offer a variety of training. Without having the full listing of various training, what I would say to individuals that if you're interested in speaking with the agency and having us come and meet with your organization to talk about training within the space of employment, that you can call the number that you see now on your screen. And I think that the person to help coordinate that would be Beth Commerce. If you want to call her at 651-539-1100 there, ask to be transferred to Beth, and we can then coordinate that for you. A question on why wasn't implicit bias talked about in the terms of disability. I do have a training as it relates to individuals with disability, and I weave in a significant portion of implicit bias training concerning individuals with disability. So questions are coming in fast and furious now. How can we move further into mitigating implicit bias and practicing intercultural competencies? I think one of the ways that we can move further into this is having a deeper appreciation of what we do know and do not know about cultural competency. And I hope that this will not be taken in an overly political manner here, but if we have the, political leaders that aren't aware that the Virgin Islands is a part of the United States, I don't think that it can be overstated that a lack of awareness and understanding is something that we need to pay more attention to. And I can say, even when I have been in the legislature listening to testimony, there are times in which I'm surprised about the lack of awareness and knowledge of some of the testifiers and other individuals there at the legislature concerning cultural competency around the world. So I think that that's something that we really need to focus in on and pay more attention to. Question about thoughts on poverty consciousness and bias related to the condition of being poor. I think, again, we're only scratching the surface as it relates to implicit bias, which exists in a wide variety of areas. We could have had some examples as it relates to implicit bias concerning what I would consider economic wealth, because there is wealth of the spirit, there's economic wealth. For example, the idea that someone is a renter as opposed to a homeowner, there is bias which exists on that level, which limits opportunities for individuals, should be addressed, should be something which we should be paying more attention to. As these other questions are being prepared here, I am reminded that the Minnesota legislature had a commission during the Palenti administration about the ending poverty by 2020. And I think within that space, there is a portion of that report that talks about and challenges us to think about poverty differently as it relates to not being limited by not thinking that poverty only occurs because of the mental or physical failings of an individual. So to me, I think that really underscores the idea of the implicit bias which sometimes exists when we think of individuals who at the present moment in time may not have as much economic wealth as some of the rest of us. When another question come in, when you encounter implicit bias, how do you address it tactfully? This is a really great question, and some of this has to do with the power dynamics within the relationship and the time and space that you're in. It's also how open that person is to being able to hear what you're saying as it relates to the implicit bias that they might have, and then also the ability to continue the conversation with the individual. I think all of those, and maybe even some more ideas should be taken into consideration in approaching it. I think for myself, there are times in which it is helpful to initiate a conversation at one point in time with the understanding that you may need to come back to it at another point. I can think of conversations that I've had in private practice with very senior individuals within an organization, appreciating that at that moment in time in which I could understand or see implicit bias being coming to the forefront for that individual, as that may not have been the time in which to address it forcefully with them. But that one-on-one conversation, an opportunity to dig a little deeper, provide a little bit more information, can have a successful result. Now, this also being said, is that there's also times in which implicit bias is playing out, in which the implicit bias could have a negative consequence or a negative impact on someone. So in that sense, as sometimes referred to as being an upstander, you may need to call out or address implicit bias at that moment in time so that the implicit bias doesn't have a negative impact on another person. So these things, I think, are important for us. I think the fact that we're thinking about these respective questions and trying to be strategic as to when to call it out, when you might be successful, what are the consequences for you if you don't call out implicit bias at that moment in time, are all the right type of questions to be asking yourself. I see there's a couple more questions which are coming in, so we'll see if we can try and answer a couple more before the end of our scheduled time today. Can I speak to MDHR staffing levels and how those impact executing the mission of the Department of Human Rights? Well, I don't want to turn in today's presentation to a telethon, but the work of the Department of Human Rights is very broad, and people who have seen me out and about in community will know that I have talked about the department being historically underfunded, to the extent that in 1996 we had 56 employees working at the department, and today we have less than 45 employees working at the department. As it relates to the work which was being done in 1996 as opposed to today, the department is responsible for the emerging entrepreneur, helping create opportunities for emerging entrepreneurs in Minnesota. We're responsible for assisting the Department of Education in the area of school bullying. We're also responsible for the Criminal Rehabilitation Offenders Act portion as it relates to private employers. And whereas in 1996, all that we audited as relates to contractors was equal employment opportunities. In addition to that, we're also now auditing contractors as it relates to equal pay. So for the department, it's pretty clear to be able to say that the department is doing more with fewer people than it has done in the past. That being said, the conversation that we're having about implicit bias is critically important. One of the three primary duties of the Department of Human Rights is to use education, conference, and conciliation to reduce discrimination, disparate outcomes. Conversations like these, I think, are very important. I think they help to put into context how sometimes negative consequences or negative events are happening and that people aren't appreciating how that's creating barriers and preventing individuals from living fully and pursuing their dreams, and that if there isn't a space for the Department of Human Rights or other entities to kind of play that role, that there's some missed opportunities for people. And I think I see that that now takes us to 3 o'clock. So I do appreciate all the questions that we had for today. This is our first seminar on implicit bias. We know that given the number of people who called in that there's interest on this respective topic. We'll probably revisit this topic, but I'm looking at my staff, and especially given the telethon number didn't really bring in a lot of money, is that presentation will probably be delayed until after at least the symposium, which gives me a good time in which to remind all of you out there to go to the Department of Human Rights website and to register for the symposium, which is going to be held on December 12th and December 13th at the St. Paul River Center. And we're very excited about the symposium. It will be 2 days. And for those of you that want to hear more about implicit bias and strategies, please know that we will have some speakers talking about implicit bias and strategies that you can implement to be more successful in combating implicit bias and creating a more diverse and inclusive workforce. So with that, on behalf of the staff here at the Department of Human Rights, my name again is Kevin Lindsay, and we appreciate you being a part of today's presentation on implicit bias. Thank you.